Okay, should we begin? I just wanted to give you some idea, and Funmi gave you a brief indication of where we've landed, but we've landed so far away from where we started. I thought it might be useful to give you some indication of how that has happened, particularly in the context of higher education policy in the country, because that's been the dominant driver of changes at King's. So let's go back to 1970. And in 1970, the University of London was the powerful institution. It, for some 50 years, had been centrally planning the university. And the main example of that is that social science was more or less exclusively the preserve of LSE. There was an economics department in Queen Mary and in UC, but essentially it was based in LSE. It received the money from the University Grants Committee, and it then sent it on to the colleges without any transparency whatsoever. We just had what I've heard called by a former member of the UGC a bag of loot. And the consequence of this, of course, was the political power plays in the university became very, very important. And King's felt, rightly or wrongly, and I can't judge this, that it wasn't well represented or playing a very good game in those power battles. So there was one change that had begun to happen, that's an important change, in that the first crack in the University of London degree system, where everybody took the same paper, whether it, whatever college they were in, came in 1969, when at least the scientists then moved over to a course unit system. It was the 1990s before the humanities actually moved over to a course unit system. First event of note was the hospital medical school reunited with King's. It happened, and King's people of the time will tell you, because of this lack of power in the university. The Flowers report recommended a consolidation of medical institutions in London into 6 schools. It was led by Lord Flowers, who just happened to be the rector of Imperial College at the time. And looking back, this is quite interesting, he proposed that the preclinical departments of King's, Guy's and Thomas's would be merged and should be joined by the Institute of Psychiatry. But the latter continuing on its present site. And King's fought this, and other institutions fought it, and the consequence was that the medical school merged back into the college in 1982. Then we begin to move on to the real change and the impact of the Thatcher government. And the very famous 1981 budget, where the government adopted a deflationary stance at a time of recession. And it required the universities to save 16% of costs within 3 years. And University Grants Committee responded by differentiating the cuts. Poor University of Salford suffered 43%. We didn't do too badly, but the University of London decided it had to act in order to plan for the future. But the astonishing thing is, and looking back on this, one still finds this difficult to believe, it left the individual colleges to make their own arrangements. Having centrally planned the university, at that key juncture, it abrogated that responsibility. So the King's response was to open negotiations with Bedford College. But I do not exaggerate, the principles fell out and it fell through. That would have been an ideal merger in terms of academic fit. As it was, I don't know how many of you remember Victor Gould, but Victor Gould, head of chemistry, persuaded the then principal, Lord Cameron, to start talking to Queen Elizabeth College. And that led to our merging. The university belatedly felt that it had to act, and it essentially, with financial power it had, insisted that Chelsea be included in the merger. So King's College London, KQC as it was known for a few years, I'll show you an example of that in a moment, was born in 1985. So the advantages and disadvantages of that merger. We acquired campuses in two pretty high-end areas of London, in Kensington, just off Kensington High Street, and in the King's Road in Chelsea. However, we were operating 4 campuses with very significant travel times between them. But most importantly, QEC and Chelsea were science colleges. There was a small school of management in QEC which was there to serve the scientific departments. But other than that, they were exclusively science colleges. And it was an absurd situation where my memory is that there were 76 staff in the physics department post-merger and a declining pool of students. So that we spent the next 10 years trying to rebalance King's as a consequence of the merger. But quite crucially, the quality of our research was diluted at a very critical time in the evolution of the national funding model. And this was the introduction in 1976 of the research assessment exercise, which initially, on a trial basis, I suppose, was introduced to inform 14% of research funding. And the exercise, they set up 60 to 70 panels with academic peers, and you submitted staff and their research records over the preceding period. 6 years later, all research funding was on the basis of the RAE exercise. And whereas at the start, there had been some money for the weak research departments, by 2001, the lowest 4 categories got nothing. And you only got any research funding from the state if you were perceived to be of higher quality. And in the first 3 RAEs, we really performed very disappointingly. It also had a very negative reputational effect because it was the RAE that gave newspapers, ever anxious to sell copy, gave newspapers an opportunity to produce league tables. Now, they were meaningless, well, meaningless now in many ways, but they were meaningless in the sense that you chose how many staff to submit to a research assessment so that you could leave out your poorer staff. Newspapers didn't understand that. So that if you wanted a high score and to appear well in the newspaper league table initially in the early years, you submitted fewer staff. Now, you got less money because there was a multiplier associated with staff, but it was never an exercise that was about league tables. It was an exercise about funding, and it was acted to our detriment. Then, marketisation of higher education, which is what I'm really talking about. then really took off in the 1986, late 1980s. First, the University Grants Committee made its resource allocation system transparent. And that was very, very fundamental, as we shall see. The Higher Education Reform Act replaced the University Grants Committee with the University Funding Council, which was a totally different type, and this is marketization, was a totally different type of an organization. The UGC was charged with giving a grant and planning the university system. The UFC was from grant-based to contract-based funding. And the notion was that it actually asked universities to bid for students at a given price in the hope that it would differentiate universities and drive down price. They failed because they made the mistake of introducing a guideline price. And for once in a lifetime, the universities did act as a cartel, and they actually then all bid the price. But obviously you can't win. So the government then changed the tuition element of the funding support and made it much more local authority related, and increased it sharply to encourage the growth in numbers at marginal cost. And then subsequently, of course, polytechnics, and this happened in 1996 eventually, became universities. Just to show this, I haven't got the King's numbers. I couldn't find them historically. This is what happened to student numbers during that period. You see this very rapid takeoff after the mid-80s up until particularly 1995. Now, King's was in a weak market position in a competitive environment. You know, that's a key fact to understand, because it makes what's happened subsequently so so impressive, frankly. We were one of the first in that context to use the devolved budgeting to introduce departmental budgeting, so that we knew how much a department was earning, and that department was allocated that money. So departments suddenly had profit and loss accounts. Now, that led positively to a very, very substantial change in that it led departments to become entrepreneurial, and certainly some members of staff with an entrepreneurial bent acting very, very impressively to increase the income. The downside was it totally destroyed collegiality, because we had a situation where people no longer talked about King's and what was good for King's. We talked about our and their money. And in particular, I hope the lawyers don't mind me saying this, the lawyers were particularly bad in this respect, because, of course, they were in a very, very strong position in terms of being able to attract international students. And the number of times I've sat through senior management meetings with this sort of argument taking place it was culturally, it was very, very divisive, very, very divisive. But nonetheless, it was a necessary step which had significant advantages, but also disadvantages. The other steps we took were to introduce a research services department to support the whole development of research, negotiating contracts, developing spin-out companies, and so on. And also an external relations department to professionalize public relations and marketing. I don't know much about the first on personal basis, so I'm just going to talk a little about what we did in marketing, because I had the privilege for 10 years leading the external relations department. First thing we had to address was, if you've got a competitive environment, you've got to have a mission statement. That you've got to differentiate yourself from other institutions. And that was very difficult. How were we different from University College? Fairly obvious how we were different from LSE and in Imperial College. We were in a situation where Queen Mary College was beginning to beat us in the league tables. So how did we differentiate ourselves from Queen Mary College? So we came to the view that what was distinctive about King's was that it was, a lot of its work was in the service of society. And interestingly, somebody wrote an article in Touch, you may have seen it 2 or 3 years ago, that opens with the sentence something to the extent that since 1829, King's has been serving society. King's between 1829 was developing organically without trying to service society. But I think it does demonstrate that mission of serving society was important. We also got rid of the crest and developed a new corporate visual identity using an incredibly high-cost public relations firm, Pentagram. I used to shudder every time I had to sign off a bill that could run to £2,000 in a month, even in the 1990s. Nonetheless, that's what one had to begin to do. So we developed this King's College London, founded 1829. And of course, the founded 1829 was all about the polytechnic sector suddenly becoming universities. We also had to differentiate ourselves from the polytechnics. And that did it pretty effectively, except I, not long afterwards, went to a conference and found out that the University of Derby was, I think, established in 1863. So this shows the sort of difference in publication between the publication on the left, which is the 1986, the first one with this nonsense of KQC, and of course you had to have the nonsense of KQC to keep Kensington and Chelsea on side, and the undergraduate prospectus in 1995 with professional photography on the front, and well, it's obviously suggests it's from a totally different class of university. So obviously we had to address development, not least. Now, King's London Alumni Association was founded in 1920. We celebrated our 100th anniversary 2 years ago. A colleague of mine, Abram Lew, sadly departed, who was a mathematician, had the foresight as early as 1985 to realize that alumni were going to be important in future funding arrangements. And so it was established in 1985. We only established the development office in 1992. And that essentially was very much because of the influence of KCLA. I always remember the day I went to Brown University, about the same size as King's then, and realized it earned as much in philanthropic support as we did from the state. And clearly, that was the way we had to go. And but we did grow it organically. We started with an annual giving campaign. We got the foundation of a good alumni relations office. We raised 35 million by 2004. The second campaign, I left for Pastors New in 2002, but the second campaign of World Questions, King's Answers, launched 600, closed having raised £600 million. However, none of this was enough, because in the research field, size was everything. You had to develop in science big research teams. It didn't matter, arts, humanities, social science, but in terms of science, they're absolutely vital. So that there's a new round of mergers, which, to be fair to Lord Flowers, does reflect Lord Flowers' view some 20 years before, that we merged with the medical and dental schools of Guy's and Tommy's, and to form the GKT School of Medicine. Again, of course, people are so proud of their institutions. Suddenly, founded 1829, was not really relevant, because St Thomas's claims it was founded, well, I think it was founded, not necessarily the medical education, which I think was 17th century, but certainly St Thomas's was founded in the 13th century. And I wasn't going to follow the University of Derby route and suddenly introduce the founded earlier date. So we had to drop at that stage, founded 1829. And also the nursing school at St Thomas's merged with our merchant school. Now, let's talk about just the changing academic profile in this context. The University of London, having abrogated responsibility at a collegiate level, suddenly decided to take responsibility at a subject level. And this led to the closure of civil engineering, and I know there's some civil engineers here, and the transfer of civil engineering to Queen Mary Westfield, as it was at the time, those two having merged, and from geology to Royal Holloway and Bedford College, as Royal Holloway was called at the time. The problem with the research assessment exercise was that it encouraged universities to close departments that were of low research caliber. Because of income, they weren't bringing in sufficient research income. And I think one of the biggest mistakes we made, I thought it at the time, but even more so in retrospect, was to close food science, which if ever a subject has become increasingly important, it's food science. And secondly, we were, I think, one of only 4 departments in the country. So if you looked at it from a marketing competition point of view, there was next to no competition in food science. But we closed food science. We downsized engineering, and again, there's probably more substance in that, because trying to run an increased size, and we were increasing the size of all our departments, an increased size of engineering department in a campus like the Strand was challenging. And so we focused on mechatronics and electronic engineering, which obviously were less space consuming. And in 2003, we closed the chemistry department. Now that was an agonizing decision. Chemistry is so fundamental to science, but, and this happened just after I'd left, but a couple of years before I'd left, we'd had an agonizing debate about closing it. And instead, and the then principal was a great Democrat. He didn't dictate. And it's the one time he went against the feelings of the college. We put, as I remember, $5 million into chemistry as an investment just before, and that probably was about 1998. But nonetheless, we closed it in 2003. Now, of course, you can't close down chemistry. That's just nonsense in a university. But we did actually close the department, although chemistry teaching continued in other departments, and chemistry research continued. So, from college to university, the diminished role of the university culminated, I suppose, in 2008, when we started awarding our own degrees. We no longer award University of London degrees. And university in all but name, King's now is a real multi-faculty university. You know, it's got nine faculties, which I won't read out. But to the extent that the last principal, who I think was probably, and I think I've seen 9 principals at King's, I think it's 9, was the outstanding, there was many outstanding ones, but I think was the outstanding principal. We now have this broad range of academic activities, but he actually wanted to change the name from college to university. But that was one of the few things in his tenure that he actually failed to convince people we should do. It's ironic in that when you were here, there were, of course, the 2 institutions. There was University of London King's College, which was the theological arm, and there was King's College London, which was the academic arm. And we opted for King's College London when the status of the theological arm changed. Because, if you remember, at that time, the governance of the college, the dean and the principal, held equal power and shared academic board on alternative occasions. The notion of doing that in a marketized institution doesn't really bear thinking about. So, this road to a multi-faculty university, we've reinstituted 2 of the departments that we'd run down, although they are offering fairly focused activities. In 2011, we reinstituted, 8 years after we closed it, we reinstituted the Department of Chemistry. And then recently, we relaunched engineering, putting substantial money, sorry, gone forward too quickly, and putting substantial money into it. I don't think closing chemistry was a mistake probably at the time, but times change, and at least King's reacted to times changing. But this is the real change. In 2000, there were 3 departments with social scientists: education, geography, and war studies. And I remember just before I left, we actually circulated all departments to try and find some social scientists that we could put in touch with one another to begin to develop some momentum in social science. And it's now one of the largest communities for social science and research in Europe, and it comprises 6 schools, as you can see there, and it has some of the leading names that frequently crop up on the BBC in that area. So clearly, we're expanding rapidly. We had to address the estate issue. Now, we inherited these campuses in the late 1980s in high rent, what we thought were high rent parts of London, but we couldn't sell them. And in the end, we came to a deal. I'm sure you'll remember Godfrey Bradman. He was quite notorious in his time as a property developer. We went into partnership with Godfrey Bradman, and he acquired the campuses and built one building and refurbished the other. So the Franklin Wilkins building was opened in 1999 in recognition of their contribution to the discovery of the structure of DNA. I don't know if the non-scientists know that story, but it's a fascinating story where essentially Cambridge pinched our empirical research and developed the double helix. And we had started, for, again, reputational reasons, we started naming buildings after some of our famous alumni. And certainly some of the most measurable, some of the most pleasurable times, my time at King's, was working with Morris, and he had this tea chest in his office, and pulling out material from actual machines from it that they'd used in developing this X-ray spectrography. And when I rang him up and said, we're going to call a building after you and Rosalind, and I said, what's your view about the order of names? And it was so definitively Morris, which he immediately responded on grounds of position in the alphabet and the preeminence of the female sex, that it should be the Franklin Wilkins building. And then we opened a second building opposite, dreadful building, named the James Clerk Maxwell building in Stamford Street, and then Newhans House on the Guy's campus. So, you know, it's impossible to make anything at the Franklin Wilkins building visually, although there's some attempt to try in the middle. That was built in 1914, one of the first concrete buildings in the country, to house the stationery office, and continued to be part of the stationery office until that time. Newhans House, designed from scratch, and then, of course, this was only part of the issue. We consolidated, we got rid of the 3 campuses, we brought them closer together, but we needed to expand. You know, we were 8,000 students at the time. We then increased further with Guy's and Tommy's. So the first thing was that we bought the Grade 1 listed Public Records Office, which had been the home of had been the home of the Public Records Office, and refurbished it as the Morn Library, which was our first major capital gift from Derek Morn, who astonishingly I had taught when I first came to King's in 1967, and was a good friend at the time. Although I take absolutely no credit for the gift, which was a quite brilliant chair at the time, who managed to achieve that gift. We then achieved a long-standing ambition to acquire part of Somerset House. Now, interestingly, we'd been offered Somerset House in the 90s when we were trying to consolidate, but it's Grade 1 listed inside and out, and there was just no way we could take the whole of Somerset House on, given the cost of refurbishing it. So we passed up an opportunity that college had been wanting for many years. But we eventually did acquire the East Wing, and we refurbished that as the Dixon Poon School of Law. And the Dixon Poon School of Law is an interesting example of fundraising, because we established our fundraising on the basis, the American basis, of alumni giving. What's happened is that we now use our brand to fundraise far more than relying on alumni. Derek, in that sense, was quite an exception in giving a significant capital gift. Dixon Poon School of Law, as you might imagine, was named as such because of a gift of the 20 million from Dixon Poon. Dixon Poon had nothing to do with King's, beyond the fact that his physician was a King's medic. That was the sole contact with Dixon Poon. And it's an interesting example. One of the things I learned is that we founded the development office on really quite a wrong premise. Not to say that alumni are not important, but we just didn't see this brand issue and people wanting to be associated with a successful brand internationally. We just didn't see that coming. And interestingly, in this country, we far lead America in this respect. I was talking to the development director of Oxford about 5 years ago, and they've got obviously a situation in spades as to who owns alumni, the colleges or the university. And she said, I let the colleges have the alumni. I fish in the big pond internationally. So there is this quite distinctive character, and that's not happened to the same extent in the States. Sorry, I digress. And then lastly, how we afforded it, I don't know when you look at the size of it, but we then acquired in 2015 a 50-year lease on the Bush House buildings. So there's and you're very welcome to go and see this either in the first stage of the afternoon or after tea. That's the inside of the Morgan Library. You know, it is quite a spectacular building. It's the biggest university library in the country. There's the north facade of Bush House. So this is now, we have succeeded in consolidating our campuses into this relatively limited area around the Thames. Interestingly, this area of the Thames is known as the King's Reach, something that we've never used in our marketing, but possibly we should have done. So, coming to a close, and talking about the present, King's strategic vision for 2029 envisages King's as a civic university, partnering with other universities, major commercial and arts organisations, local authority, to benefit both King's and London. Now, we've long-standing partnerships with Royal Opera House, Globe Theatre, V&A Museum, to meet the needs of the cultural community, and working with local boroughs, particularly to support school leavers. And the essential thing in terms of supporting school leavers to think in terms of higher education is to tackle them young. So not at the age of 16, but at the age, possibly, in Scotland, they do it at the age of 8. But certainly we work with the schools from the early years of secondary school. And King's has always, I think, had the reputation of working for the benefit of the less fortunate. A very, very good example of this is the pre-medical program starting in the early 90s that took students from 24 students from inner London boroughs who were considered to be outstanding potential and gave them an extra year, pre-med year, to enter medical school. And the first year they graduated, the 2 top graduates were from that intake. And just to show an example of the importance we attach to culture, we persuaded Deborah Bohr, who is obviously a well-known dancer and subsequently creative director at the Royal Opera House, to join us as Director of Cultural Partnerships in 2012. And she's now a Vice Principal with a broader profile. So the student profile, 20 to 2021, we, on the last official count, we enrolled 31,000 full-time students, along with nearly 7,000 part-time students. And the great difference from your time is that 37% of them were master's students. Now, master's students were very, very thin on the ground 50 years ago. I left geography, finally, in 1987, I think it was. We didn't have a master's program. There's now 150 people in a master's program in geography. Overseas students, they comprised 40% of the student body. When I left in 2002, it was only 20%. Don't know how many it was in 1970, but of course, although they were educated without charge, there were very, very few overseas students. It's interestingly, the principal during nearly all my time as head of external relations took the view that we shouldn't expand our overseas student body, on the grounds that you could get classes dominated by overseas students, particularly postgraduate classes, and that it was, as a consequence, potentially unstable, but that you also were unstable in terms of that source of income, that it wasn't a reliable source of income. Now, one might think this would have been borne out by COVID. I always remember, I think 3 years ago, going to a degree ceremony in my current role, and the award of Masters in Digital Humanities. And there were, I think there were about 120 graduates. I don't think one of them was native white, native parents, as American census jargon would describe it. I don't exaggerate when I say there were 10 Zhengs, 10 people with the surname of Zheng. And my immediate reaction was, COVID was, this is showing the problem of putting too many eggs in an overseas student's basket. In fact, it's had very, very little impact. People still want to come to King's. Now they come on a somewhat different basis now, but nonetheless, COVID didn't affect our overseas student numbers at all. So again, I'm coming to a close, we started the 21st century with a very small percentage of overseas students compared to the rest of the sector, because of the previous principal's view, which I have a lot of time for, but, and I fully understand. So we had catching up to do. But the way we caught up was essentially through a partnership approach. We've now got contacts with 150 universities abroad, which we've developed partnership arrangements with. And this, I think this was the masterstroke by a vice principal who was also transferred from the geography department, who decided that the way to approach it, there was this dreadful reputation of universities abroad, that we were all about recruiting students and it was all about money. And I've been to countless, particularly in America, countless events where somebody would stand up and talk about, particularly, and in my mind, the University of Essex. But there was this very, very unhealthy competition going on overseas. And there was this impression that we were all about using overseas students as a cash cow. And what Keith did was to establish schools, institutes in King's for the major countries, for China, for Brazil, for India, less so Australia, that pre-existed. But that suddenly opened up funding actually from those countries' governments to develop those schools, those institutes, and to appoint staff and studentships and so on. And I think that was an absolute masterstroke in developing our overseas students. And then just to look at the league tables. Don't like doing so, but they're a fact of life. And we now perform very well in them. In terms of the research excellence framework, which replaced the research assessment exercise, but fundamentally the same, 55% of our research was ranked as world leading. We're 6th in the country in terms of power rankings, which gets over this problem of you can submit who you like still by then weighting it by the size of the submission. And we're the 3rd ranked university about in terms of impact in the UK. In terms of university ranking internationally, in 2022, we were ranked 35th in the world, scoring particularly heavily on, I think, the 2 most important components: citation, in which we had 97% of the top mark, which is classed as 100, and international outlook. So, we come to a close. King's vision in the latest 2029 strategy is to make the world a better place. Our mission as KCLA is to develop, engage, and represent the King's alumni community and act as its voice to help achieve King's vision to make the world a better place. And we exist on volunteers. We get next to no support from the alumni office. And at the moment, our lack of volunteers is constraining our ability to achieve what we want to achieve. So I'd like to close by saying that if anybody amongst you, are feeling so good about being a King's graduate, I'm sure you already feel good about being a King's graduate, but feeling even better about being a King's graduate after today, and you would like to join us in a more active role, we'd be delighted. Sue Searle, who's Vice Chair, and I would be absolutely delighted to talk with you. Thank you very much.